This is a brief overview of an artificial life system called Polyworld. It combines computational genetics, physiology, metabolism, neural systems, learning, vision, and behavior, all the principal components of life as we know it, in a single computational ecology in order to explore one model of life as it might be. Polyworld was built in order to approach artificial intelligence the same way that natural intelligence emerged, through the evolution of neural systems. It also offers us a chance to investigate artificial neural systems as they are applied to complex behavioral tasks. And inherent to its bottom-up approach, Polyworld allows us to work our way up the intelligence spectrum, evolving a computational plesia before we attempt a computational human mind. For intelligence should not be seen as something unique to humans, but rather as a spectrum of adaptive behaviors ranging from the simplest organisms to the most complex. An important element of Polyworld is its reliance on simple models of artificial neural systems. To set the stage for how real and artificial neural systems relate, let's briefly examine one of the most important aspects of real neural systems, self-organization into brain maps. Every popular hypothesis is brain versus right brain function, but the division of labor in the brain is much more ordered and detailed than the cortex, the outer the brain, has been shown to partition into specific areas devoted to language, vision, other senses, and motor control. In fact, a slice through a human's motor cortex can be even more finely mapped out, with certain ranges of cells corresponding to the activation of various body parts, providing a somatotopic map of the body in the cortex. A 3D visualization of the relative proportions within that map give us an idea of just how fine a degree of control we have over the various body parts, how we look to our motor cortex. This ability to self-organize functional maps is one of the most important and intriguing characteristics of real nervous systems, and thanks to the speculation of Donald Hebb, and here the computational application of those ideas by Ralph Linsker, we see an exciting demonstration of self-organization within artificial neural systems on the right that qualitatively behave much like the orientation selective cells in a real visual cortex on the left. Both the orientation selection function of the cells and the patchy coherency of their distribution were emergent properties of the neural architecture, layered receptive fields, and the learning rule used at the synapses between neurons, something called Hebbian learning. Hebbian learning is a wonderfully simple rule that merely states that the connections between neurons that fire synchronously are strengthened, and in some implementations that the connections between neurons that fire asynchronously are weakened. One aspect of this kind of self-organization is a kind of neuronal cooperation, where a number of cells cooperate to model some portion of their input space. Here, the top image shows color-coded synaptic strengths between neurons initially assigned randomly, while the bottom image shows those same synaptic strengths after repeated excitation of the inputs to the system. Note the bright red and orange islands of neurons with strong connections between them, separated by blue lagoons of weak connectivity. These structures self-organized, again as a result of the Hebbian-like learning rule used by John Pearson and Gerald Edelman to control synaptic efficacy. Another important aspect of neuronal self-organization is neuronal competition. That is, cells are always competing to represent and respond to the inputs they receive. Just as we saw with the motor cortex devoting many more cells to controlling the complex motor skills of the fingers when compared to, for example, the arms. Pearson and Edelman were also able to demonstrate this kind of dynamic allocation of resources in their artificial neural model of a monkey's hand and cortex. The vertical columns in these images result from color coding the response properties of the cells in the simulated somatosensory cortex and map directly to the fingers of the hand. The top image corresponds to applying approximately equal stimulation to each of the simulated fingers, while the bottom image is the result of repeatedly overstimulating just one of the fingers. Note the greatly expanded orange-coded section towards the right, which has grown at the expense of neighboring regions by recruiting additional neurons to model the overstimulated digit, a phenomenon known to occur in real monkeys. Again, these fundamental properties of self-organization were obtained in a simple artificial system of neurons employing a Hebbian-like learning rule. Armed with this brief introduction to artificial neural systems, let's now take a look at how they are manifested in Polyworld, and just what Polyworld really is. First, it's an ecological simulator, an ecology. The organisms of ecology have a genetic structure and evolve over time. They have simple physiologies and metabolisms, and they have neural network brains. Brains with a quite arbitrary, evolved neural architecture that perform Hebbian learning at the synapses. These brains are used to control a suite of primitive behaviors based on input provided by a sense of vision. Computer graphic rendering techniques are used to permit the polygon-based organisms to see their polygon-based environment, including each other. The organisms are born, live, and die, and their fitness as an individual is determined purely by natural selection, survival of the fittest, once an evolutionarily stable strategy has emerged and their numbers are self-sustaining. In early stages of development, the system can be run in a sort of online genetic algorithm mode, for which there is an ad hoc fitness function defined by the user. Before discussing Polyworld or its foundations any further, let's take a look at a sample run of the system. Here you see the standard set of displays, the largest window providing an oblique rotating view of the entire world, a world which consists of a dark green ground plane, brown barriers that partially isolate regions of the world, bright green blocks of food, and the multicolored organisms that inhabit the world. Along the top of the screen are a bunch of small windows providing a view of the world from each organism's point of view. In the upper right corner are some simple numerical statistics for the run, and in the lower right corner is an overhead view of the world. This overhead view can be zoomed in and out and can be forced to center itself over specific organisms and follow their paths through the world. All aspects of organisms in Polyworld are controlled by their genetic code. One group of the organism's genes can be thought of as controlling their physiology, their size, strength, and maximum speed. Another single gene directly controls the green coloration of the organisms, serving as a sort of genetic marker and potentially supporting mimicry. A sort of meta-level genetics is provided by the presence of genes that control the genetic mutation rate and the number of crossover points used during the reproduction process, as well as the organism's maximum lifespan. Finally, the fraction of energy that is passed from parent to offspring is encoded in the genes, which could potentially support a bifurcation into reproductive partners that contribute unequally to offspring, as with many real species. A fairly general mapping from genes to neural architectures has been implemented in Polyworld. First, there are genes that specify the number of neurons that will be devoted to each color component of vision. Then a single gene specifies how many neuronal groups or distinct clusters of neurons are present in the brain. For each group, then, there is a gene to specify the number of excitatory neurons and the number of inhibitory neurons present in that group. There is also a neuronal bias and a bias learning rate specified for each group of neurons. The synaptic connections between these neuronal groups are then specified by way of a connection density and a topological distortion between each pair of groups, and for each type of neuron, excitatory to excitatory, excitatory to inhibitory, and so on. The connection density just specifies the fraction of possible connections that are actually present. The topological distortion specifies the degree to which those connections are made in a sequence randomizing versus a sequence preserving order. So random connections, such as are present in the olfactory system, are at one end of the spectrum, while strict retinotopic maps, such as are present in the visual system, are at the other end of the spectrum, and the full spectrum is supported. Finally, a learning rate is also genetically specified between these neuronal groups and types so that evolution can favor hardwired instinctual solutions, learning solutions, or hybrids. I won't spend much time discussing the organism's physiology and metabolism except to note that everything the organism does expends energy, including thinking, and their physiology and neurophysiology affects how much energy is expended in a reasonable fashion. The organisms have to replenish this energy by eating food, or by killing and eating other organisms, which become food upon death. All of the organism's behaviors are controlled by their nervous systems, the inputs to which are their perceptions. The primary sense mechanism is vision. The scene is actually rendered from each organism's point of view, and the resulting pixel map is fed as input to the neural network, like light falling on a retina. Organisms can also sense the state of their internal energy store, and a single randomly firing cell is present that evolution can choose to wire into the nervous system or not. The outputs of the neural network are essentially the organism's behaviors. A single neuron has been devoted to each of 7 primitive behaviors. Eating, fighting, mating, moving, and turning have obvious meaning and functionality. In addition, the organisms have control over a sort of light on the front of their bodies, sort of like fireflies, and they also are able to control the width of their field of view. Their desire to mate controls their blue color component, visible both to us as observers and to other organisms. Similarly, their desire to fight controls their red color component. I'll now show you some close-up views of a few primitive behaviors to make interpreting the more complex simulations a bit easier. First up is eating. If you'll watch the organism that crosses from top left to bottom right, you'll see that it rolls over a block of food, eating it as it goes. We'll repeat that sequence again. The block of food shrinks to nothing as its energy is depleted. Next is fighting. The larger of the two red organisms on the bottom edge is killed and then eaten by the smaller of the two organisms. We'll play that again. Next up is mating. This is a little more difficult to see, especially in such a toy world, but watch the two closest organisms center screen. They give birth to another organism that materializes midway between them and then promptly kills and eats the parents. We'll show that again. It's important to note that reproduction only occurs if both organisms express their mating behavior. The last sample behavior is lighting. Watch the bright polygons on the front of the large red organism in the foreground. That bright cap of polygons that dims slowly while we watch is under control of the organism's nervous system. This occurs slowly enough that we'll only show it once. Just as important as the prescribed functionality of the input and output neurons is the fact that the internal neurons and all of the synaptic connections between neurons have no pre-specified function. It is this architecture and attendant functionality that we desire to evolve rather than hand-tailor. The first implementation of Polyworld had organisms all of whose nervous systems had essentially the same basic wiring diagram, everything connected to everything, with the genes merely encoding the synaptic strengths on those connections. Some of the simpler species and behaviors you will see later were obtained with this type of architecture. Here's a look at one organism's entire nervous system. At the extreme bottom edge of the brain internal window is some color that represents the organism's vision. Just above that are the neuronal states at the beginning of a particular time step. These are then mapped through the large crossbar of synaptic connections to the same neurons, but showing their states at the end of the time step in the leftmost vertical column. And if we set this in motion, you can see the neurons changing state rapidly, while the synapses change much more slowly. And we'll show that again. Organisms in today's Polyworld have arbitrary evolving neural architectures. Here are three example nervous systems exhibiting varying degrees of connectivity, inhibition and excitation, and overall brain size. As with the previous display, neuronal states are shown mapped through a crossbar of synaptic connections, but this time not all possible connections are actually present in the crossbar. And if we look at a few of these in motion, again, watch for the rapid neural activity and the slow synaptic learning. I won't delve into the neural system dynamics much, except to note that a simple summing and squashing neuron model and classic Hebbian learning are the basis of the artificial nervous systems of the organisms in Polyworld. One of the goals in developing Polyworld was to see if individual and social behaviors might be attainable that were not programmed in. And Polyworld has quite successfully given rise to a number of different species, each with their own survival and reproduction patterns, as well as complex emergent behaviors that are easily recognizable as valuable ethological level strategies found in real living organisms. To this extent, Polyworld seems to serve well as a sort of proof of concept system for the field of artificial life. We'll now take a look at a few of these species and emergent behaviors. First up is the first evolutionarily stable species found, a colony I refer to as the joggers. These organisms basically just run straight ahead their entire lives, always wanting to eat and always wanting to mate. In an early, primitive, and benign enough world with no barriers and wraparound borders, this strategy proved to be adequate. Next up is a frequently recurring group known as the Indolent Cannibals. These organisms always stay close to both parents and offspring, mating with each other, fighting with each other, killing and eating each other when they die. You can see the very beginning of a cannibal cult starting up on the right-hand side of the world. The colony spreads in a very organic-looking fashion as the colony population grows. Jumping forward in time, we get a closer look. From this angle, the colony looks kind of like a Conway game of life, only continuous, non-gridded. It turns out that the moniker cannibal is a bit of a misnomer, since colonies similar to this have evolved even when organisms are not allowed to become food when they die. The dominant reason for these types of colonies seems to be the ease with which reproductive partners can be found. Jumping even farther forward in time, we see that the cannibals have a survival strategy that is quite stable, even if this video isn't. Here we see three different thriving cannibal groups. In this world, however, group dynamics and continued evolution present a more variable fitness landscape. As we watch, the two smaller colonies effectively disperse, leaving just the one large colony towards the center of the screen. Jumping forward in time, we see that even this large colony proves ultimately to be unstable. The various organisms of this world still exhibit an evolutionarily stable strategy, with their numbers being self-sustained through reproduction, but they are no longer living in these so-called cannibal cults. Another recurring species, the edge runners, spend most of their lives running around the edges of the world. So long as enough of them are doing it, they can find mates and food, dead carcasses, along the route. So this is an especially cooperative, evolutionarily stable strategy. This behavior also tends to behaviorally isolate the species, reducing the degree of genetic dilution of the species. Here we look in on a world while initially there is still a fair bit of genetic diversity, organisms of different physiologies and behaviors. But as we watch the offspring of the large and small organisms on the front edge turn epileptic and demonstrate its relative lack of fitness, we see a swarm of the small organisms that will eventually dominate this world swing by. Jumping forward in time, we see that, interestingly, though it is difficult to see by their physiologies, evolution has continued to operate on this population. Though most of the organisms still run around the edges of the world for most of their lives, many of them now stop at some point, late in their lives, and manage to produce several offspring before they die by mating with the younger organisms still circulating. On a Bratenberg-style tabletop world, with edges that are fatal for organisms falling off of them, a simple species called the Dervishes emerged. This species learned to turn in small loops that avoided the dangerous edges of the world, yet still brought them into contact with potential mates and food. If you watch the edges of this world, you'll be able to see a number of lesser fit organisms run off the end of the world, effectively plummeting to their deaths. This was the first, and only to date, solution that any species has found for surviving on a tabletop world, and the solution is surprisingly stable. We'll jump forward in a second, almost 1,000 generations, where we'll see essentially the same behavior patterns still dominating. Though it is difficult to see in this especially poor quality video image, evolution does continue to act, even though the movement behavior patterns remain the same. In the original simulation, patterns and waves of color could be seen sweeping through the populations over several generation time frames. These colorations suggested that evolution was still optimizing and re-optimizing for the level of predation or fighting that was being expressed in these populations, with some clearly behaving aggressively, others not, in a sort of continuous prisoner's dilemma problem. We will now look at a few of the individual behaviors that contribute to the survivability, hence the fitness of various organisms. None of these behaviors were programmed in. The first such behavior is a simple response to objects within an organism's field of view. If you watch the organism being highlighted, you should be able to notice that it is relatively quiescent, except when other organisms cross its field of view. The same is true of its offspring. From the same simulation, I will now use the highlight to draw your attention to a different organism. This one is moving at a fairly constant rate, again, until another organism crosses its path and enters its field of view. A simple survival strategy might certainly be to run away if attacked. Observing the still highlighted organism, note that it generates no response to one non-aggressive organism that passes completely through it. Yet when touched by a red predator, it accelerates immediately and runs off-screen. To finish these sample behavior videos, I'd like to show you a longer excerpt from one of my most recent simulations. In a single ecology, you should be able to see organisms using their visual systems to seek food, to engage in swarming or flocking behaviors, and to follow or chase one another. While one can immediately spot some real dervishes here that are not particularly fit since their tight spins prevent them from finding food or mates, notice the highlighted organisms that are using their vision system to guide them to food and to orbit that food until sated or until another item of interest enters their visual field. Follow the larger organism as it circles each piece of food until it is finally distracted by the swarm of smaller organisms to its right. This swarm is a fairly stable structure, allowing the members of the swarm to readily find mates, even as the swarm drifts to find additional food supplies. Next, the highlight will draw your attention to an organism that is particularly adept at avoiding food, traversing the entire length of the world without touching a single piece. Obviously not a particularly valuable survival skill and a behavior that won't last long in this world. Various examples of food-seeking and swarming behavior can be spotted around the world, but the next highlighted behavior will be a simple following maneuver amongst 3 organisms. Given the lifelike behavior of the organisms of Polyworld, it is only natural to ask, are they really alive? Farmer and Berlin, in the second A-Life conference proceedings, offer a checklist for the essential attributes of living systems. Life is a pattern in space-time rather than a specific material object. This statement was made explicitly to fly in the face of traditional hydrocarbon biases. Polyworld's organisms certainly satisfy this criteria, perhaps even validating it. Self-reproduction. Polyworld's organisms do self-reproduce, and even have a degree of volition associated with mating and reproduction. Information storage of a self-representation. The organisms of Polyworld use the same basic method for storing information about their self-representation that biological organisms do, a genetic code. A metabolism. The organisms of Polyworld have a simple metabolism that converts energy obtained from the environment to actions upon that environment, which answers the next point, functional interactions with the environment. It might also be worth noting that besides acting upon the more static environment, the Polyworld organisms are themselves an important part of each organism's environment. Interdependence of parts. Farber and Berlin just wanted to indicate that cleaving a living organism in 2 typically does not result in 2 identical living organisms. Certainly this is true of the organisms in Polyworld, who would probably not be viable organisms were their genetic code chopped in 2, nor would they be the same organisms were their physiologies mixed and matched independently of their neurophysiologies. Stability under perturbation. On the other hand, the organisms of Polyworld routinely survive small perturbations in their genetic codes and resulting physiologies, and entire species have re-evolved in multiple simulations. The ability to evolve is inherent to the basic design and functionality of Polyworld. Its organisms can and do evolve. So, the organisms of Polyworld would seem to readily satisfy all of Farmer and Berlin's criteria for life. It would appear that we either need to refine these criteria or welcome an entire new genus to the world. There are many improvements or directions for research that can be imagined at this point. Rather than discuss them here, I'll just note the most fanciful. That is, that the organisms that are now evolving in Polyworld already exhibit many of the behavioral characteristics we associate with living organisms. Perhaps in the not-so-distant future, it would make sense to extricate some of the more successful organisms from their homeworlds, place them in suitably designed test environments, and carry out some classical conditioning experiments on them. Being fully designed by humans and capable of being completely instrumented for scientific study, they would make the perfect computational lab rats. One obvious direction for future work is simply more, bigger, and longer. But how much more, bigger, and longer? I would like to run simulations with approximately 1 million organisms, 1 million generations, and 1 million neurons, rather than the current hundreds or thousands of these quantities. So, a factor of 10 to the 10 more compute power would let me carry out simulations that rivaled nature's own experiments in approximately 1 week. It is interesting to note that this is approximately the compute power that one might wish to devote to the simulation of a human brain. Approximately 1 fast computer per neuron. But no one really knows how to model a human brain, even if such compute power was available. On the other hand, that amount of power might allow me to evolve a number of new species of computational lab rats every week. And this is how: by the evolution of neural systems. And such compute power may not be as outrageous as it seems at first. Polyworld currently runs on a Silicon Graphics Iris, a moderately fast workstation. A factor of 10 to the 3 or 10 to the 4 is probably available today by going to an appropriate parallel processor. And faster massively parallel processors are coming. So I'd like to think that the future for Polyworld and Polyworld-like systems is completely open-ended, and have made the source code for Polyworld available to anyone with internet access to help facilitate this line of research. The notion being that if we can indeed create a computational aplysia and then a computational lab rat, then perhaps we really are on the right scientific path to creating computational human-level intelligence and beyond.